Last year, 60 million Americans exposed their most intimate family history to the internet. They uploaded DNA samples, shared birth certificates, and paid monthly subscriptions to massive databases promising a bridge to their ancestors. But almost all of them hit the same invisible barrier. It isn't 1776 or the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620. For the vast majority of people searching for their roots, the names stop, the records vanish, and the family tree becomes a collection of dead ends at the year 1870. If you ask a professional genealogist why this happens, the answer sounds perfectly reasonable at first. They will tell you that birth certificates weren't mandatory until the early 1900s. They will point to the 1890 census, the most detailed population count in American history, and tell you it was simply lost in a tragic accident. It is a convenient explanation that satisfies most people for a while. But when you look at the timeline of that accident, the details don't just feel unfortunate, they feel deliberate. The 1890 census was a masterpiece of data. It documented nearly 63 million Americans with a level of detail never seen before. Immigration status, naturalization records, the number of children born versus those surviving, and even which side a person served on during the Civil War. It was the only comprehensive snapshot of the transition generation, the people who actually remembered the world before the mid-19th century. On January 10th, 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington District of Columbia. The official story is that the census was destroyed, but the reality is that the fire only damaged a portion of the records. Half of the 63 million names survived the heat and the smoke. Those records then sat in storage for 12 years. There was no attempt to salvage them, no effort to copy them, and no restoration. They were left to rot in the damp dark of a government warehouse. Then, on February 21st, 1933, Congress took a final, irreversible step. They authorized the total destruction of what remained of the 1890 census. Out of 63 million names, only about 6,000 survived. But here is the part that should make your blood run cold. Exactly one day later, on February 22nd, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives, a state-of-the-art fireproof facility built specifically to prevent this kind of loss. Why was the most important record of the American people authorized for destruction just 24 hours before the building that could have saved it forever began construction? Was it bureaucratic incompetence, or was it the final brick in a wall designed to keep you from ever knowing who your family really was before the smoke cleared? This isn't just a story about a fire, it's a story about a systematic erasure that genealogists call paper genocide. And it was happening at the local level in courthouses across the entire country. The destruction of the federal census in Washington was a massive blow, but for a determined researcher, the local courthouses should have been the safety net. In every county in America, there were supposed to be marriage licenses, land deeds, and probate records that could reconstruct a family tree even without a federal census. But when you look at the map of the American South, you find a phenomenon so widespread that genealogists have a specific name for it: burned counties. You might assume these fires were random accidents, the unfortunate result of wooden buildings and oil lamps, but the statistics tell a different story. 40% of Alabama's counties lost their records to fire. 40% of Georgia's counties were wiped clean. In Mississippi, it was the same. In Tennessee, 60 out of 95 counties experienced significant record loss. In many of these places, the courthouses didn't just burn once, they burned 2 or 3 times, often just years apart, specifically targeting the rooms where the vital records were kept. In Port Tobacco, Maryland, a suspicious fire in 1895 destroyed the courthouse so completely that the town lost its status as the county seat and faded into obscurity. In North Carolina, Lenoir County lost its records in 1878 and then again in 1880. These weren't just tragedies, they were erasures. These fires eliminated the paper trail for land ownership, mixed-race ancestry, and property claims that contradicted the official narratives of the post-war era. One researcher called it paper genocide, the systematic removal of the legal proof that certain people ever owned land or existed at all. Even more disturbing are the eyewitness accounts. In several instances, residents reported seeing courthouse employees removing boxes of documents and loading them into wagons before the fires started. If these records weren't destroyed by the flames, where did they go? There are persistent rumors of private collections, held under lock and key by the families who rose to power after the fires, containing the very deeds and birth records that the public is told no longer exist. But the paper wall isn't just about what was burned, it is about what was never written down. Before 1900, the vast majority of Americans had no birth certificates. When Social Security was established in 1935, millions of people were forced to file delayed birth certificates. The government was essentially asking an entire generation to prove they were real. They had to hunt for baptismal records or handwritten entries in family Bibles. If your great-great-grandmother was born in 1880, The only proof of her life might be a single line in a Bible that has likely been lost, sold, or destroyed in yet another accidental fire. This creates a terrifying reality. Before 1870, millions of Americans simply do not exist in the eyes of the law. And for one specific group of 4 million people, the year 1870 represents a total reset of their identity. But as they stepped into the light of history, they discovered that the surnames they chose to represent their freedom were about to become the very thing that made them impossible to track. For 4 million Americans, the year 1870 wasn't just a date on a calendar. It was the moment they were granted a documented identity. Before the census, enslaved people were treated by the federal government as nameless inventory. If you look at the 1850 or 1860 records, you won't find names for these individuals. Instead, you will see slave schedules, separate pages where human beings were listed only as ages and genders under the name of the person who claimed to own them. When the 1870 census takers began their rounds, they were recording the first generation of free black families. Suddenly, 4 million people needed surnames. This was a moment of profound agency. Many chose names that reflected their new status: freeman, liberty, or justice. Others took the names of prominent figures or even their former enslavers, not out of loyalty, but out of a need to keep families connected under a single recognizable title. But this surge of new identities created a unique problem for the paper wall. The fluidity of these names was often weaponized by the system. A man might use one surname for the census and a different one for his church records to avoid being tracked by hostile local authorities. Families were frequently split across different pages because a census taker, often a former Confederate soldier, refused to record their chosen names correctly. This created a genealogical maze that remains nearly impossible to navigate today. An entire population's history was effectively restarted at zero in 1870, with their previous centuries of life buried in the nameless tick marks of the slave schedules. But this reset wasn't exclusive to one group. If your ancestors were white and arrived in America before 1820, you're likely facing the exact same void. Before the Steerage Act of 1819, the federal government didn't require ships to provide passenger lists. Approximately 80% of immigrants who built the early colonies were never documented at a federal level. The National Archives admits this plainly. They have no arrival records for the millions who arrived before 1820. So we have a pattern emerging. Enslaved Americans have no names before 1870. Immigrants have no manifests before 1820. And the general population has no birth certificates before 1900. Every major bridge to our pre-industrial past has been compromised, burned, or simply never built. This leaves us with a haunting question. If the government didn't keep these records, or allowed them to burn, where is the information now? As it turns out, the records didn't all burn. They were gathered. While the public was told that their history was lost to time and tragedy, a private organization was busy building a nuclear-proof fortress to house the largest collection of human identities ever assembled. And the reason they want your family tree has nothing to do with helping you find your roots. It is about a spiritual ritual that you never agreed to. While the public was mourning the loss of courthouse records and census data, one organization was quietly building the most comprehensive genealogical archive in human history. Deep in the Little Cottonwood Canyon of Utah, carved into a solid wall of granite under 700 feet of stone, sits the Granite Mountain Records Vault. This facility is nuclear-proof, earthquake-resistant, and climate-controlled. It is operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and it holds over 2 billion names on microfilm, preserved for eternity. You might ask why a religious organization would spend millions of dollars to protect the birth records of people who aren't even members of their faith. The answer lies in a doctrine called baptism for the dead. The Church believes that deceased ancestors can be posthumously baptized into their faith by proxy. To do this, they need names, billions of them. This is why they have dispatched microfilm teams to every corner of the globe for decades, filming parish registers, cemetery records, and tax lists before they can be lost to time or fire. This massive collection is the backbone of family search, but its influence goes much deeper. Ancestry.com, the company most Americans pay to trace their trees, was founded by graduates of Brigham Young University and built using these very church records. Today, Ancestry is owned by the Blackstone Group, a global private equity firm that purchased the company for $4.7 billion. When you pay your monthly subscription to find your great-grandfather, you are participating in a system where your data is shared between a billion-dollar investment firm and a religious organization with a very specific spiritual agenda. This has led to massive ethical battles. In 1995, Jewish groups discovered that the church had posthumously baptized hundreds of thousands of Holocaust victims without family consent. Despite agreements to stop, names like Anne Frank and various Jewish martyrs continue to appear in these proxy records. You never consented to your ancestors being drafted into a new religion, but because they hold the only surviving copies of the records, they hold the power over your family's identity. Think about the irony. the government, which is supposed to serve you, let your records rot and burn. But a private entity found those records valuable enough to entomb in a mountain. This creates a centralized monopoly on human history. If you want to know who you are, you have to pay a toll to a corporation that is built on a foundation of religious proxy gathering. But as we look at this centralized control, a terrifying pattern begins to emerge. Why was the 1890 census, the one that captured the transition generation, the first and only census to be stored without local backup copies? Every previous census had redundant copies kept at the state level. For 1890, they broke that rule and put every single page in one vulnerable basement. Was it just a coincidence that this happened right as the official narrative of American history was being standardized? Or was the 1870 wall built to hide something much larger, a history that doesn't match the one we are taught in school? If you wanted to disconnect a population from its true origins, you wouldn't necessarily need to ban history books. You would simply need to ensure that the primary source documents, the actual evidence of who lived where and owned what, became impossible to find. This is where the 1890 census transition becomes so suspicious. From 1790 all the way through 1880, the federal government maintained a strict policy of redundancy. Local copies of census records were kept at the state and county levels. If the building in Washington burned, the history of the people remained safe in their home states. But in 1890, for the very first time, that rule of redundancy was abandoned. Every single page of the most detailed census in history was sent to one single basement in the Commerce Building. There were no state backups. There were no county duplicates. 63 million names were placed in one vulnerable, damp location. When the fire finally broke out in 1921, the accidental destruction wasn't just a loss of data, it was the total removal of the only bridge between the pre-industrial world and the modern era. This wasn't just bureaucratic laziness. The decision to let those records rot for 12 years after the fire, refusing to dry them, refusing to copy them, and then authorizing their total destruction just 24 hours before a fireproof archives building was completed, suggests a deliberate cutting of the paper trail. We are told that history is a linear story of progress, but the 1870 wall serves as a hard reset. It ensures that the vast majority of Americans cannot verify the stories their grandmothers told them about where they came from or what the world looked like before the smoke cleared. This creates a vacuum where the official narrative becomes the only reality. If your family history contradicts the textbooks, you have no way to prove it because the deeds are burned and the census is ash. You are left with a choice. Believe the government-sanctioned story, or try to find a type of record that can't be destroyed by a courthouse fire or a basement flood. But here is the danger. We are currently living through the final window of time where that alternative record even exists. The generation that actually heard the unvarnished truth from their ancestors is fading away. And once they are gone, the paper wall isn't just a barrier. It becomes our entire world. But what if there's a record even deeper than paper? What if the very DNA tests we use to find our cousins are being used to map something far more valuable than a family tree? Something that could be used to identify the survivors of a history we were never supposed to remember. The paper wall was designed to be permanent. By ensuring that the 1890 census was ash and the southern courthouses were ruins, the architects of this erasure left us with nothing but the official narrative. But they forgot one thing. Paper isn't the only way a family keeps its score. There's a record that doesn't rot in a damp basement and cannot be authorized for destruction by a congressional committee. It is the oral tradition, the unburnable record. The stories your grandmother told you about the old country, the names of the towns that don't appear on modern maps, and the descriptions of a world that sounds nothing like the textbooks. These are not just tall tales. They are fragments of a suppressed reality. They are the only data points that survived the 1870 reset. But we are currently standing at the edge of a precipice. We are the last generation that will have direct contact with the people who heard the truth before it was sanitized. Once that generation passes, the paper wall isn't just a barrier. It becomes our entire world. This is why the current obsession with DNA testing is so double-edged. While 60 million Americans are using these kits to find their cousins, the companies behind them, often backed by the same private equity firms that own the genealogical databases, are building a genetic harvest. They are mapping the survivors of the pre-1870 world. They know that while they could burn the courthouses, they couldn't burn your blood. Your DNA is the ultimate ledger, holding the secrets of migrations and identities and lineages that the paper genocide tried to erase. But who really owns that ledger once you check the I agree box on their website? You are paying for the privilege of handing over the last piece of evidence you have left. The question isn't whether you can find your great-grandfather. The question is what they are finding in you. By centralizing our genetic data alongside the Granite Mountain archives, they are completing the circle of control that began with the fire in the Commerce Building basement. They have replaced our true history with a subscription service. So how do we break through? To find what lies behind the 1870 wall, we have to look where they didn't think to look. We have to record the stories now before they are lost. We have to cross-reference the family Bibles that still exist with the suspicious fire dates. We have to treat our family history like the investigative crime scene it actually is. The paper trail was cut, but the connection remains. The 1870 wall only works if we accept the silence. It only works if we believe that, because there is no paper, there is no past. But as you sit with the names you've found and the ones you have in T, ask yourself one final question. If our history was as simple and unfortunate as they claim, why did it require a nuclear-proof mountain to protect the pieces they kept? What is so dangerous about your true origin that it had to be entombed in granite? The wall is there to keep you in, but once you realize the bricks are made of lies, you can finally start to climb.